Listen carefully, France. I just exposed your secret mining contract that robbed our wealth for 65 years, and your hidden clause raises African rage that will hunt you down. You believed your lawyers hid the theft where we'd never look. You thought we'd stay blind and stupid while you stole billions and lived like kings. You were wrong. I found every single page, read every poisoned word, and I uncovered your crime, and now you'll pay. This is your final warning. Return what you stole or face the fury of 54 nations. We're coming for everything. Let me show you exactly how I discovered this hidden theft, what the clause actually said, and why exposing it changes everything for Africa's 54 nations. I was reviewing old government files in the National Archives when I found something strange. There was a mining contract from 1960, the year Burkina Faso gained independence. The contract gave French company Arriva rights to mine uranium. Nothing unusual so far. Every former French colony had similar contracts. But this contract had an extra section. It was written in tiny print at the bottom of page 47. The section was titled Special Provisions, in French legal language that was deliberately confusing. I almost missed it. Most people who saw this contract probably did miss it. I read the clause carefully. It said that Burkina Faso agreed to sell all uranium to France at a friendship price that was 15% of the global market rate. The clause would remain in effect for 99 years. It could not be changed without French government approval. Any leader who tried to cancel it would face appropriate consequences. I sat there stunned. This wasn't a business contract. This was organized theft with legal paperwork. France was taking our uranium and paying us 15% of what it was worth. They had locked us into this robbery for 99 years. They had threatened any leader who resisted. But the theft was even larger because France used our cheap uranium in their nuclear power plants. Those plants generated electricity worth $2.3 million annually. France built their entire energy system on stolen African uranium. They powered their economy with our resources while paying us almost nothing. I checked whether other former French colonies had similar clauses. I contacted leaders in Niger, Mali, Gabon, and Central African Republic. I asked them to search their mining contracts from independence. Within weeks, they all confirmed the same thing. Every former French colony had identical secret clauses. Niger's clause covered uranium and paid 12% of market price. Mali's clause covered gold and paid 18% of market price. Gabon's clause covered uranium and manganese and paid 14% of market price. Central African Republic's clause covered diamonds and paid 16% of market price. The percentages varied slightly, but the theft was systematic. I calculated the total theft across all former French colonies. France had stolen $3.4 trillion from Africa over 65 years through these secret clauses. This was separate from other forms of exploitation. This was just the mining contracts with hidden theft clauses. The clauses all had the same threatening language about appropriate consequences for leaders who resisted. Now I understood why so many African presidents who challenged France died mysteriously or faced coups. The consequences weren't theoretical. They were real and violent. I remembered that Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader in the 1980 seconds, had tried to renegotiate mining contracts. He demanded fair prices for our resources. He challenged French control. In 1987, he was killed in a coup. The new government immediately confirmed all French contracts. Now I knew why. I counted 17 African leaders who had challenged French mining contracts since 1960. 14 of them were removed from power through coups or assassination within 2 years. 3 survived but were forced to back down. The pattern was clear and terrifying. France enforced these secret clauses with violence. But I also realized that times had changed. In the 1960 seconds through 1990 seconds, France could remove African leaders easily. They controlled our militaries. They had bases everywhere. African countries were isolated and weak. But by 2025, things were different. China was active in Africa. Russia had interests here. African countries were more connected to each other. France's power had weakened. I decided to expose the secret clause publicly. I called a press conference and invited journalists from across Africa and the world. I brought copies of the 1960 contract. I showed them page 47 with the hidden clause. I explained what it meant in simple terms. I said, France has been stealing from us for 65 years. They hid a clause in our independence contract that forced us to sell uranium at 15% of market price. They have taken $4.9 billion from Burkina Faso alone. They have taken $3.4 billion from all their former colonies. This is why Africa stays poor while France is rich. They are robbing us with legal paperwork. The reaction was immediate and explosive. African people were furious. They had always suspected France was stealing, but now they had proof. They had the actual contract language. They could see the theft in black and white. The anger was overwhelming. French officials panicked. They claimed the contracts were legal and binding. They said we had agreed to the terms. They insisted the friendship price was fair given French investment in our countries. They threatened consequences if we broke the contracts. But their arguments sounded hollow. Everyone could see that 15% of market price wasn't friendship, it was robbery. Everyone understood that threatening leaders who resisted proved the contracts were forced, not agreed. Everyone recognized that French investment was tiny compared to what they stole. I announced that Burkina Faso was canceling the contract immediately. I said the clause was signed under duress by a puppet government that didn't represent our people. I declared that we would sell our uranium at full market price to whoever offered the best terms. I invited Chinese, Russian, and Indian companies to bid. France threatened sanctions. They said they would cut aid. They warned of economic consequences. They implied military action. But I had prepared for this. I had already secured alternative buyers. I had built relationships with other countries. I had organized support from across Africa. Within 48 hours, 12 other African countries announced they were also canceling their secret clause contracts. Niger, Mali, Gabon, Central African Republic, Chad, Togo, Benin, Ivory Coast, Senegal, Guinea, Mauritania, and Madagascar all followed Burkina Faso's lead. The wave was unstoppable. France couldn't sanction or coup 13 countries simultaneously. They didn't have the capacity. Their threats were empty. For the first time, collective African action had defeated French power. The secret clauses that had stolen from us for 65 years were finished. We immediately renegotiated with new buyers. China offered to buy our uranium at 95% of market price. Russia offered 93%. India offered 91%. We chose China because they also offered to build a uranium processing facility in Burkina Faso, creating 2,300 jobs. The new contract generated $845.5 million annually, compared to $133.5 million under the French clause. That was an increase of $712 million per year. For Burkina Faso, with a national budget of $3.4 billion, this was a 21% increase in government revenue. We used the additional revenue immediately. We built 450 new schools. We hired 5,600 teachers. We constructed 23 health clinics. We paved 340 kilometers of roads. We installed clean water systems in 89 villages. We did in 1 year what we couldn't do in 10 years under French theft. But more important than the money was the psychological liberation. For 65 years, we had been trapped in a system designed to keep us poor. We had worked hard, but our resources were stolen. We had tried to develop, but the theft prevented progress. Now we were free. We controlled our own resources. We could build our own future. Listen carefully, France. Remember when you thought we'd never find your hidden clause? Remember when you believed your lawyers had buried the theft perfectly? Remember when you assumed African leaders would stay too scared to challenge you? I shattered every assumption. I found page 47. I read the secret language. I exposed your 65-year robbery. Your threats failed. Your sanctions failed. Your power is broken. The exposure had effects beyond the 13 countries that canceled contracts. Leaders across Africa's 54 nations started reviewing all their agreements with former colonial powers. They were searching for similar hidden clauses in other sectors: oil, diamonds, gold, copper, timber, fishing rights. They found them everywhere. Britain had secret clauses in Nigerian oil contracts, paying 22% of market price. Portugal had clauses in Angolan diamond contracts, paying 19% of market price. Belgium had clauses in Congolese copper contracts, paying 17% of market price. Every colonial power had used the same method. The total theft across all of Africa from all colonial powers was estimated at $1.2 trillion over 65 years. This was just from secret pricing clauses in resource contracts. It didn't include other forms of exploitation like the CFA franc, debt traps, or unfair trade agreements. The scale of robbery was almost incomprehensible. But now it was exposed. African people knew exactly how they had been robbed. They had the contract language. They had the calculations. They had proof. The knowledge was power. It made resistance possible. Countries started canceling exploitative contracts across the continent. By mid-2025, 34 of Africa's 54 nations had renegotiated or canceled at least one colonial-era contract. The wave of economic liberation was spreading faster than anyone predicted. The immediate economic impact was significant. The 34 countries that renegotiated contracts increased their resource revenues by an average of 340%. This generated an additional $89 billion annually across Africa. For a continent with total GDP of $2.8 trillion, this was a 3.2% increase in economic output just from fair pricing of resources. But the long-term impact would be even larger. With control over their resources, African countries could build processing industries. Instead of exporting raw uranium, we could enrich it ourselves. Instead of selling raw gold, we could refine it. Instead of shipping crude oil, we could refine it into fuel. Each processing step added value and created jobs. I announced plans to build a uranium enrichment facility in Burkina Faso. The facility would cost $450 million to construct. It would employ 1,200 workers. It would increase the value of our uranium by 400%. Instead of selling raw uranium for $845.5 million, they claimed uranium enrichment was dangerous and could be used for weapons. They pressured the International Atomic Energy Agency to deny us permits. They warned other countries not to help us. They used every tool to prevent us from adding value to our own resources. But China agreed to provide the technology and training. Russia offered technical support. India sent engineers. The facility was built in 18 months. By late 2026, Burkina Faso was producing enriched uranium. We had moved up the value chain. We were no longer just a source of raw materials. Other countries followed the same path. Niger built an enrichment facility, Gabon built a manganese processing plant, Mali built a gold refinery. Each country was adding value to their resources instead of just exporting them raw. Africa was industrializing. The industrialization created millions of jobs. The uranium enrichment facility in Burkina Faso employed 1,200 people directly and 3,600 people in supporting industries. The gold refinery in Mali employed 890 people directly and 2,670 inches support. Across the 34 countries that built processing facilities, total employment was 4.5 million new jobs. These were good jobs with decent wages. Workers at the uranium facility earned $12,000 annually compared to the national average of $1,800. Workers at the gold refinery earned $9,800 annually. The jobs lifted families out of poverty. They created a middle class. They transformed communities. The facilities also generated technology transfer. Chinese, Russian, and Indian engineers trained African workers. After 2 years, the facilities were operated entirely by Africans. We had gained the knowledge and skills. We could build more facilities ourselves. We were developing technical capacity. But France didn't give up easily. They launched a propaganda campaign claiming the new contracts were corrupt. They said Chinese companies were exploiting Africa worse than France ever did. They warned that Africa was trading French colonialism for Chinese colonialism. The propaganda failed because African people could compare. Under French contracts, we received 15% of market price. Under Chinese contracts, we received 95% of market price. Under French control, we exported raw materials. Under Chinese partnerships, we built processing facilities. The difference was obvious. France also tried economic pressure. They reduced aid to countries that canceled contracts. They imposed tariffs on exports. They restricted visas for African citizens. They used every economic weapon they had. But the impact was minimal because the increased resource revenues more than compensated for lost aid. I calculated the economics. France had given Burkina Faso $45 million in annual aid. They cut this to zero, but our increased uranium revenue was $712 million annually. We lost $45 million but gained $712 million. The net benefit was 667 million. The net benefit was 667 million. French economic pressure was irrelevant. The same pattern held across Africa. Countries that lost French aid gained far more from fair resource prices. The 13 countries that canceled contracts first lost a combined $890 million in French aid, but gained $23 billion in increased resource revenues. The ratio was 26-to-1 benefit to cost. France also tried to use international institutions. They pressured the World Bank to deny loans to countries that canceled contracts. They convinced the IMF to downgrade credit ratings. They used their influence in international courts to support French companies suing for compensation. But these efforts also failed. China established the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that provided loans to African countries. Russia offered financing through its development bank. African countries weren't dependent on World Bank loans anymore. We had alternatives. The international lawsuits were more challenging. French companies sued Burkina Faso for $2.3 billion in compensation for canceled contracts. They claimed we had violated international investment law. They demanded payment for their lost future profits. I argued that the contracts were signed under duress and were fundamentally unjust. I presented evidence of the 14 African leaders who were killed or couped for challenging French contracts. I showed that the friendship prices were actually theft. I demonstrated that the contracts violated our sovereignty. The International Arbitration Court ruled in our favor. They found that contracts signed immediately after independence under threat of violence were not valid. They determined that pricing 85% below market rates constituted exploitation, not legitimate business. They dismissed all French claims for compensation. The ruling was historic. It established that colonial-era contracts could be challenged and canceled without compensation. It gave legal backing to what African countries were already doing. It legitimized economic liberation. By 2027, 47 of Africa's 54 nations had canceled or renegotiated exploitative colonial contracts. Only 7 countries still had the old agreements, and they were under pressure from their own citizens to follow the continental trend. The liberation was nearly complete. The economic transformation was visible everywhere. Government revenues increased by an average of $67 billion annually across the continent. This funded massive infrastructure development. Schools, hospitals, roads, and power plants were built in every country. Services improved dramatically. But the psychological transformation was even more important. For 65 years, Africans had been told we needed foreign expertise to manage our resources. We had been told we should be grateful for foreign investment. We had been told we couldn't survive without colonial powers. All of this was lies designed to justify theft. By exposing the secret clauses and canceling the contracts, we proved the lies wrong. We managed our resources better than foreigners did. We negotiated better deals than colonial contracts offered. We survived and thrived without exploitative relationships. We discovered our own power. I documented systematic improvements in resource management following contract cancellations that destroyed colonial narrative claiming African incompetence justified foreign control. Under French contracts with secret clauses, uranium extraction in Burkina Faso operated at 67% efficiency due to deliberate underinvestment by companies profiting from below-market prices. After nationalization and renegotiation with China, efficiency increased to 89% through proper equipment maintenance and technical improvements. We managed operations better than corporations that claimed superior expertise. Under colonial contracts, environmental damage from mining was extensive because companies faced no accountability. Contaminated water affected 47 villages near uranium mines. Radioactive waste was stored improperly, threatening public health. After taking control, we implemented strict environmental standards, remediated contaminated sites, and established monitoring systems protecting communities. We protected our environment better than foreign corporations that claim to follow international standards while poisoning our land. Under exploitative pricing, Burkina Faso received $133.5 million annually for uranium while spending $89 million on mining operations, netting only $44.5 million for government services and development. After renegotiating at market prices, we received $845.5 million annually, while operating costs remained $89 million, netting $756.5 million for national development. We negotiated 17 times better revenue than colonial contracts delivered, proving we could secure fair terms when freed from coercion. We survived French threats of appropriate consequences for contract cancellation. France reduced aid by $67 million annually, imposed informal trade barriers, and pressured international institutions to downgrade our credit rating. But Chinese partnership provided $2.1 billion in financing, replacing French aid many times over. BRICS trade relationships absorbed exports that France blocked. Gold-backed currency eliminated dependence on Western credit ratings. We not only survived French retaliation but thrived through alternatives that proved more beneficial than exploitative relationships we ended. We discovered our own power through demonstrating that collective action defeated threats that isolated nations couldn't resist. When 13 countries canceled contracts simultaneously, France couldn't coup all governments or invade all nations. When 47 countries joined liberation movement, Western pressure became ineffective because isolating half of Africa was economically and politically impossible. Unity transformed weakness into strength, fear into confidence, and dependency into sovereignty. The youth were especially energized by revelations about colonial theft. They had grown up hearing that Africa was poor because Africans were incompetent or corrupt. Now they learned that Africa was poor because we were robbed systematically through contracts designed for theft. They understood that changing contracts could change everything about African development trajectory. They saw that resistance worked when properly organized and sustained. Young people across the 54 nations organized to find and expose other forms of exploitation beyond mining contracts. They researched fishing rights and found that European companies were taking $4.5 billion in fish annually while paying only $230 million in fees, a 95% extraction rate similar to mining theft. They investigated timber contracts and found similar patterns where logging companies paid 8% of timber value while extracting 92%. They examined agricultural export agreements, telecommunications contracts, and infrastructure concessions, finding exploitation in every sector. I supported youth-led research initiatives by providing government documents, funding investigations, and protecting young activists from intimidation. Youth researchers accessed colonial archives, discovering contracts hidden for decades. They interviewed elders who remembered negotiations where African leaders were threatened into signing. They analyzed current agreements, finding modern versions of colonial exploitation. Their research was thorough, documented, and impossible to refute. Fishing rights investigation revealed that European Union negotiated agreements with 14 West African countries, granting EU vessels access to fishing waters for fees averaging $230 million annually, while taking fish worth $4.5 billion. Agreements were presented as partnership and development assistance, but functioned as legalized theft. EU vessels depleted fish stocks, harming local fishermen who lost $890 million in annual catches. Coastal communities suffered food insecurity as fish that fed them was exported to Europe. I calculated exact exploitation mathematics. EU paid $230 million for fish worth $4.5 billion, receiving $19.50 in value for every $1 paid. Over 30 years of these agreements, EU extracted $135 billion in fish, while paying $6.9 billion, stealing $128.1 billion through legal contracts. Meanwhile, African fishing industries collapsed because industrial EU vessels caught fish faster than populations could reproduce, destroying sustainable livelihoods that had fed coastal communities for generations. Youth activists organized fishing communities across 14 countries demanding contract renegotiation. They documented stock depletion, calculated fair compensation, and proposed sustainable fishing agreements protecting African interests. They coordinated protests in multiple countries simultaneously, making it impossible for governments to ignore demands. Within 18 months, 11 countries renegotiated fishing agreements, increasing fees from $230 million to $1.2 billion annually, while reducing catch limits to sustainable levels, protecting stocks and local fishermen. Timber contract investigation revealed similar theft where European logging companies paid 8% of timber value while extracting 92%. Companies undervalued timber through claiming lower quality than actual, inflating transportation costs, and manipulating market prices in transfer pricing schemes. They logged protected species illegally, damaged ecosystems, and displaced indigenous communities. They paid $340 million annually for timber worth $4.25 billion, extracting $3.91 billion through exploitation. I documented specific mechanisms of timber theft. Companies assessed timber at $80 per cubic meter when market value was $500 per cubic meter, claiming African timber was lower quality despite exporting it to premium markets. They inflated transportation costs from $12 per cubic meter actual cost to $67 per cubic meter claimed cost, reducing taxable income. They sold timber to parent company subsidiaries at $95 per cubic meter, then immediately resold at $500 per cubic meter, shifting profits to tax havens through transfer pricing. Youth activists organized forest communities demanding contract cancellation and sustainable forestry. They documented illegal logging, calculated stolen value, and proposed community-managed forestry, generating more revenue while protecting ecosystems. They coordinated across 9 countries, creating unified demands. Within 2 years, 7 countries canceled exploitative contracts and implemented community forestry, generating $2.1 billion annually while preserving forests and supporting local livelihoods. Each exposure led to renegotiation or cancellation through organized pressure, making maintaining exploitative contracts politically impossible. Each renegotiation increased African revenues and reduced foreign theft, proving that fair agreements were achievable when we organized collectively. Each success built confidence and momentum as nations observed that resistance worked and exploitation could be ended. The liberation was accelerating as more sectors were investigated and more contracts were challenged. I recognized that this was just the beginning of comprehensive liberation, requiring addressing all forms of exploitation. We had addressed mining contracts and were addressing fishing and timber agreements, but exploitation existed in many additional forms. The CFA franc still controlled 14 countries' currencies, extracting wealth through monetary manipulation. Debt payments still drained $45 billion annually through odious debts and inflated interest rates. Unfair trade agreements still limited our industrial development through prohibiting tariffs protecting infant industries. Complete liberation required addressing all these issues systematically, but exposing the secret mining clauses had proven that liberation was possible even when exploitation seemed permanent and unchangeable. For 65 years, these clauses had operated hidden in contracts that governments were threatened into maintaining. France had enforced them with violence, couping or assassinating 14 African leaders who challenged contracts. International law had protected them through investment treaties and arbitration systems favoring corporations. They had appeared invincible to generations who accepted exploitation as inevitable. Yet we had defeated them through research, finding hidden language, public exposure, creating political pressure, collective organization, preventing isolation, resistance to threats through unity, and renegotiation securing fair terms. If we could defeat secret clauses that had operated for 65 years, we could defeat everything else that oppressed us through applying the same strategy: research, expose, organize, resist, renegotiate, build alternatives. The strategy was clear and replicable across all exploitation forms. Research agreements defined exploitation through accessing archives, analyzing contracts, calculating value transfers, and documenting mechanisms. Expose it publicly with evidence through media campaigns, public education, and international advocacy, creating pressure for change. Organize collective action across multiple countries through coordinating demands, synchronizing actions, and building unified positions, preventing divide and conquer. Resist threats through unity, making retaliation too costly and demonstrating alternatives, reducing leverage. Renegotiate or cancel unjust agreements through using collective power to demand fair terms. Build alternative relationships with fair partners, replacing exploitative arrangements with beneficial cooperation. This formula worked for mining contracts and would work everywhere. I calculated what Africa would look like in 2035 if we continued this liberation across all sectors systematically. With fair prices for all resources, including minerals, fish, timber, and agricultural products, African revenues would increase by $234 billion annually from current $89 billion to $323 billion. With processing industries adding value through refining minerals, processing fish, manufacturing timber products, and producing finished agricultural goods, this would grow to $567 billion annually. With fair trade agreements allowing industrial exports through eliminating tariff restrictions and market access barriers, total benefit would reach $890 billion annually. Over 10 years from 2025 to 2035, the cumulative benefit would be $6.7 trillion in additional wealth captured by African nations instead of extracted by foreign corporations. This wealth would build infrastructure connecting continent through roads, railways, ports, and telecommunications. It would develop industries processing resources and manufacturing products for domestic and export markets. It would invest in human capital through education and training, creating skilled workforce. It would transform Africa from the poorest continent with $2.8 trillion GDP and $2,100 per capita income to middle-income region with $9.5 trillion GDP and $4,500 per capita income. The transformation would be visible in concrete improvements. Infrastructure investment of $2.2 trillion would build 340,000 kilometers of paved roads, 67,000 kilometers of railways, 89 new ports, and universal telecommunications access. Industrial development of $1.9 trillion would create 45 million manufacturing jobs in processing and manufacturing sectors. Education investment of $890 billion would build 120,000 schools, train 2.3 million teachers, and achieve universal primary and secondary education. Healthcare investment of $670 billion would build 23,000 hospitals and clinics, train 890,000 health workers, and provide universal healthcare access. But if we failed to continue the liberation, the old exploitation would return in new forms as colonial powers adapted strategies. They would write new contracts with hidden clauses in different locations, learning from exposure to hide theft more carefully. They would use debt to control us through lending with conditions requiring policy changes serving their interests. They would prevent our industrial development through trade agreements prohibiting protection and investment treaties enabling corporate lawsuits against regulations. Africa would remain poor despite abundant resources because wealth would continue flowing to former colonial powers through updated extraction mechanisms. I understood that exposing page 47 clauses was not permanent victory but opening battle in ongoing struggle. Colonial powers had centuries of experience exploiting Africa and would adapt to our resistance. They would learn from our exposure of friendship prices and hide theft differently. They would study our contract cancellations and design agreements harder to challenge. They would analyze our collective action and develop strategies to divide us. Exploitation would evolve, not disappear, unless we remained vigilant and continued liberation systematically. New contracts would hide exploitation through complexity rather than secrecy. Instead of single clause on page 47 specifying below market prices, new contracts would spread theft across dozens of provisions. Royalty rates might appear fair at 7% but be calculated on artificially low base values. Tax rates might match standard 30% but apply only after inflated costs reduce taxable income. Processing requirements might appear to mandate local value addition but include exceptions allowing raw exports. Each provision individually would appear reasonable while collectively enabling extraction comparable to old contracts. I documented examples of evolved exploitation in contracts negotiated after page 47 exposure. Mining contract in Guinea signed in 2025 specified 7% royalty, appearing fair compared to old 3% rates. But royalty was calculated on mine head value, defined as market price minus transportation, processing, and marketing costs. These deductions reduced royalty base by 40%, making effective royalty rate 4.2% rather than stated 7%. Hidden theft through complex definitions rather than simple below-market pricing. Resource contract in Madagascar signed in 2025 specified 30% corporate tax matching standard rate, but contract allowed deducting reasonable management fees paid to parent company. Management fees were set at 18% of revenue, reducing taxable income substantially. Combined with inflated equipment costs and other deductions, effective tax rate was 12% rather than stated 30%. Hidden theft through inflated costs rather than reduced rates. Processing contract in Mozambique signed in 2025 required that 40% of production be processed locally, appearing to mandate value addition. But contract included exception, allowing raw exports if processing facilities lacked capacity. Company deliberately underinvested in processing facilities, ensuring they lacked capacity, then exported 87% of production raw under capacity exception. Hidden theft through exceptions, undermining requirements rather than openly refusing processing. Colonial powers would use debt to control us through lending, with conditions requiring policy changes serving their interests. Debt control was more subtle than military occupation or exploitative contracts, but equally effective for maintaining dominance. Countries that borrowed from IMF and World Bank had to implement structural adjustment programs requiring privatization, market liberalization, and reduced government spending. These conditions prevented industrial development, eliminated policy autonomy, and maintained dependence. I calculated that debt control would intensify if we didn't build alternative financing. African countries needed approximately $120 billion annually for infrastructure, industry, and social development. If this financing came from IMF and World Bank, it would come with conditions preventing the very development it supposedly financed. Conditions would require privatizing state enterprises that could anchor industrialization. Conditions would prohibit tariffs protecting infant industries. Conditions would mandate reduced government spending, limiting education and healthcare investment. Debt would finance dependence rather than development. But if financing came from BRICS, New Development Bank, and African institutions, it would come without destructive conditions. BRICS financing respected sovereignty and allowed countries to pursue development strategies serving their interests. African institutions would be designed explicitly to finance industrialization and development. Alternative financing would enable liberation rather than maintaining exploitation. Colonial powers would prevent our industrial development through trade agreements, prohibiting protection and investment treaties, enabling corporate lawsuits against regulations. Trade agreements would require eliminating tariffs on imports competing with domestic industries. Investment treaties would allow corporations to sue governments for regulations reducing profits. Combined effect would prevent industrialization by exposing infant industries to foreign competition while preventing governments from regulating corporations. I documented how trade and investment agreements maintained dependence. WTO agreements prohibited tariffs protecting infant industries, forcing African countries to open markets before domestic industries were competitive. Result was that imported manufactured goods destroyed domestic production. African countries remained raw material exporters because they couldn't protect industries during development phase. Trade agreements maintained colonial division of labor, where Africa exported raw materials and imported manufactured goods. Investment treaties with ISDS provisions allowed corporations to sue governments for regulations affecting profits. Corporations sued for environmental regulations, labor standards, and resource nationalization. Lawsuits created chilling effect where governments avoided regulations fearing multi-billion-dollar awards. Investment treaties maintained corporate power by giving corporations veto over government policy through lawsuit threats. Africa would remain poor despite abundant resources because wealth would continue flowing to former colonial powers through updated extraction mechanisms. New contracts would hide theft through complexity. Debt would control policy through conditions. Trade agreements would prevent industrialization through prohibiting protection. Investment treaties would prevent regulation through lawsuit threats. Exploitation would continue through evolved mechanisms unless we continued liberation addressing each new form. The choice was clear, and stakes were absolute. We had to continue exposing and ending exploitation in all its forms through systematic application of proven strategy. We had to maintain unity across the 54 nations through coordinating actions and supporting each other against retaliation. We had to resist threats and pressure through demonstrating alternatives and collective strength. We had to build fair relationships with partners who respected us through engaging with BRICS and Global South nations, offering genuine cooperation. We had to complete the liberation through addressing every exploitation mechanism until Africa controlled its own destiny. Continuing liberation required applying research, expose, organize, resist, renegotiate strategy to all exploitation forms. Research new contracts, finding hidden theft through complex provisions. Expose debt control, documenting conditions preventing development. Organize against trade agreements prohibiting industrialization. Resist investment treaties enabling corporate lawsuits. Renegotiate or cancel all arrangements maintaining exploitation. Build alternatives through BRICS financing, South-South trade, and African institutions. Maintaining unity required deepening continental coordination through regular summits, permanent institutions, and mutual support. African Union would coordinate liberation strategy. African Sovereignty Fund would support countries facing retaliation. Continental institutions would provide alternatives to Western-controlled systems. Unity would prevent divide and conquer that had maintained exploitation by isolating resistant countries. Resisting threats required demonstrating that alternatives existed, and collective strength made retaliation costly. BRICS partnerships provided trade, financing, and investment, replacing Western relationships. South-South cooperation created markets and partnerships independent of Western approval. Continental solidarity meant that pressuring individual countries triggered collective response. Alternatives and strength made threats ineffective. Building fair relationships required engaging with partners, offering genuine cooperation without exploitation. BRICS nations provided financing without conditions, trade at fair prices, and technology transfer without control. Global South nations offered partnerships between equals rather than between exploiter and exploited. Fair relationships proved that cooperation was possible without exploitation and that Africa could prosper through sovereignty rather than dependence. Completing liberation required addressing every exploitation mechanism systematically until Africa controlled its destiny completely. Mining liberation was advancing. Fishing and timber liberation were beginning. Debt, trade, and investment liberation would follow. Each addressed exploitation form increased sovereignty. Complete liberation would achieve comprehensive independence, where Africa controlled resources, policies, industries, and development trajectory without foreign interference. I am the architect of exposing France's secret mining theft that operated for 65 years. I found the 1,960 contract with the hidden clause on page 47, requiring uranium sales at friendship prices defined as 15% of market value. I discovered the mechanism through which France paid $8.90 per kilogram when market price was $59.30 per kilogram. I calculated that France stole $49.2 billion from Burkina Faso over 65 years through this single contract and $340 billion from all former colonies through identical clauses in 13 countries. Contracts. Finding the contract required 18 months of research in French colonial archives. I personally led team that accessed archives in Aix-en-Provence, where independence negotiations were documented. We sued under French freedom of information laws after archivists claimed contracts were classified. We won legal battle in March 2023 and received 847 pages, including complete Burkina Faso independence contract. I read every page methodically, analyzing provisions and cross-referencing with other agreements. Page 47 contained the mineral resource clause that would transfer hundreds of billions over following decades. Discovering the mechanism required calculating actual payments versus market prices over 65 years. I obtained payment records from Burkina Faso Treasury showing amounts received for uranium sales. I compared these to international uranium market prices published by industry organizations. I discovered that payments averaged 15% of market prices consistently from 1,960 to 2025. I calculated cumulative theft of $49.2 billion from Burkina Faso alone. I verified that identical clauses existed in other countries' contracts through requesting documents from national archives in 12 former French colonies. Every contract contained same page 47 clause with same formula. I calculated theft from each country based on their mineral production and market prices. Total theft across 13 countries, $340 billion over 65 years. France had systematically stolen from entire former empire through identical hidden clauses in all independence contracts. I exposed this publicly with evidence through press conferences, published documents, and international advocacy, creating pressure France couldn't ignore. Press conference on the 12th of April 2023 released contract and presented calculations. I published complete analysis on government website, making evidence accessible globally. I provided documents to international media ensuring coverage. I addressed African Union explaining theft and urging collective action. I testified at UN Human Rights Council documenting colonial exploitation. Exposure created political pressure that made maintaining contracts impossible. I canceled the contract unilaterally, citing colonial coercion and ongoing theft as justification. Legal basis was that contracts signed under duress are invalid and that ongoing theft justified immediate termination. France protested, claiming breach of international law. I responded that international law didn't protect contracts obtained through threats and maintained through violence. I stated that Burkina Faso would not honor agreements that stole our wealth regardless of their legal status under systems designed to protect exploitation. I renegotiated with China at 95% of market price, increasing uranium revenue from $133.5 million to $845.5 million annually. We see a 533% increase, proving fair agreements were possible. Chinese offer came within weeks of contract cancellation, demonstrating that alternatives existed and that we didn't need French relationship. Negotiation took 6 weeks, far shorter than 18 months of difficult negotiations with France. Agreement was straightforward with transparent pricing and no hidden clauses. Fair partnership was achievable when both parties negotiated in good faith. I inspired 12 other countries to cancel their contracts immediately after seeing Burkina Faso's success, creating a wave of liberation that France couldn't stop. By 2027, 47 of 54 African nations had canceled or renegotiated exploitative mining contracts, ending colonial theft that had operated since independence. I proved in international court that colonial contracts signed under duress were invalid, establishing legal precedent for canceling exploitative agreements without compensation to corporations that had profited from theft. I generated $67 billion in additional annual revenue across Africa through contract cancellations and renegotiations, money that previously flowed to foreign corporations but now funded African development. I created 4.5 million jobs in processing industries built to add value to resources instead of exporting them raw. I calculated that continued liberation across all sectors would generate $6.7 trillion in benefits by 2035, transforming Africa from poorest continent to middle-income region. Your legacy is 65 years of secret theft through hidden contract clauses that stole $340 billion from Africa while threatening and killing leaders who resisted France. Your legacy is 14 African leaders couped or assassinated for challenging contracts. Your legacy is friendship prices, paying 15% of value while claiming partnership. Your legacy is building French prosperity on African poverty through systematic theft, disguised as legal agreements. Your legacy is violence enforcing exploitation when African leaders sought fairness. My legacy is exposing your crime through finding hidden clauses and calculating stolen wealth. My legacy is canceling your contracts through organizing collective action across 13 countries simultaneously. My legacy is liberating Africa's resources through proving liberation was possible and inspiring continental movement. My legacy is building prosperity for 2.1 billion people across 54 nations through capturing wealth that you stole for 65 years. My legacy is proving that African control of African resources generates development while foreign control generates only poverty. History will remember which approach served humanity through comparing outcomes under exploitation versus liberation. The answer is written in contract cancellations, spreading across 47 countries, proving exploitation was systematic in processing facilities, creating millions of jobs, proving we can add value, in increased revenues, building schools and hospitals, proving wealth serves development when captured locally, in African control of African resources, proving sovereignty generates prosperity. You stole for 65 years through hidden clauses that we didn't know existed. We exposed and ended your theft in 2 years through organized resistance that you couldn't stop. The lesson is eternal because exploitation always generates resistance when exposed. The proof is spreading as more countries discover and cancel exploitative contracts. The outcome is permanent because liberated nations will never accept recolonization. France hid secret clauses in mining contracts that forced us to sell resources at 15% of market price for 99 years through inserting language on page 47 of independence agreements that leaders signed under threat. They threatened appropriate consequences for leaders who resisted through military intervention, economic sanctions, and political destabilization. They killed or couped 14 African leaders who challenged the contracts, including Olympio in Togo, 1963, Keita in Mali 1968, Sankara in Burkina Faso 1987, and others across 6 decades. They stole $340 billion over 65 years through paying 15% of value for uranium, gold, diamonds, and other minerals. They built their economy on our stolen resources while claiming we were poor because we were incompetent. I documented the precise mechanism of French theft through analyzing the 1960 independence contract between France and Burkina Faso. The main contract text on pages 1 to 46 appeared standard, covering diplomatic relations, trade cooperation, and cultural exchange in language suggesting equal partnership between sovereign nations. But page 47, buried in technical annexes labeled Mineral Resource Cooperation Framework, contained the exploitation clause that would transfer hundreds of billions in wealth from Burkina Faso to France over following decades. The clause specified that uranium, gold, and other strategic minerals would be sold to French state companies at friendship prices, defined as prices reflecting the special historical relationship between France and Burkina Faso. The definition appeared benign, suggesting preferential pricing between partners. But the clause's operational section specified the actual formula. Friendship prices would equal 15% of prevailing international market prices as determined by the French Ministry of Industry. I calculated the theft this formula enabled with precision. In 1960, uranium market price was $6.70 per kilogram. Friendship price at 15% was $1.01 per kilogram. Burkina Faso produced 12,000 tons annually, generating revenue of $12.1 million at friendship prices versus $80.4 million at market prices. Annual theft, $68.3 million. Over 65 years, from 1960 to 2025, cumulative theft from Burkina Faso uranium alone, $4.44 billion adjusted for inflation and production increases. But uranium was only one mineral covered by the clause. Gold production averaged 8 tons annually from 1960 to 2025, at market prices averaging $890 per ounce, 31.1 grams per ounce, 8 tons 257,000 ounces, was worth $228.7 million annually. At friendship prices of 15%, France paid $34.3 million annually. Annual theft, $194.4 million. Over 65 years, $12.6 billion in stolen gold wealth. Diamond production averaged 340,000 carats annually. At market prices averaging $890 per carat, production was worth $302.6 million annually. At friendship prices, France paid $45.4 million annually. Annual theft, $257.2 million. Over 65 years, $16.7 billion in stolen diamond wealth. Cobalt, manganese, phosphates, and other minerals covered by the clause added another $15.5 billion in theft over 65 years. Total theft from Burkina Faso through the page 47 clause, $49.2 billion over 65 years. This amount exceeded Burkina Faso's entire GDP of $32 billion in 2025, proving that France had literally stolen more wealth than our entire economy currently produced annually. But Burkina Faso was not unique. France inserted identical clauses in independence contracts with 13 former colonies: Benin, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Republic of Congo, Gabon, Guinea, Ivory Coast, Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Togo. Each contract contained the same page 47 clause with the same friendship price formula. Each country's resources were stolen at the same 15% rate for the same 65 years. I calculated total French theft across all 13 countries. Niger's uranium was particularly valuable, producing 4,500 tons annually, worth $266.9 million at market prices, but sold for $40 million at friendship prices. Annual theft, $226.9 million. Over 65 years, $14.7 billion stolen from Niger. Gabon's oil was covered under similar provisions, with 12 million barrels annually worth $720 million at market prices, but sold for $108 million at friendship prices. Annual theft, $612 million. Over 65 years, $39.8 billion stolen from Gabon. Across all 13 countries and all covered minerals, France stole $340 billion over 65 years through the page 47 friendship price clause. This theft was legal according to contracts that leaders signed, but the contracts were signed under coercion that invalidated consent. Leaders who negotiated independence were told explicitly that refusing the mining provisions would result in France maintaining colonial control indefinitely or granting independence to puppet governments that would sign. France threatened appropriate consequences for leaders who resisted through military intervention, economic sanctions, and political destabilization. The threat was not abstract, but backed by demonstrated willingness to use violence. When Sylvanus Olympio of Togo attempted to renegotiate the mining contract in 1963, French military intelligence organized coup that resulted in his assassination. When Modibo Keïta of Mali nationalized French mining operations in 1968, French-backed military coup overthrew him and installed government that restored the contracts. When Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso challenged French exploitation in 1987, French intelligence supported coup that killed him and reversed his policies. I documented 14 African leaders killed or couped between 1960 and 2025 for challenging French mining contracts or related exploitation. Olympio Togo, 1963, Keïta Mali, 1968, Ngouabi Congo, 1977, Sankara Burkina Faso, 1987, Habyarimana Rwanda, 1994, Kabila Democratic Republic of Congo, 2001, and 8 others whose deaths were attributed to internal conflicts but involved French intelligence according to declassified documents and testimony from former intelligence officers. The pattern was consistent. Leader challenges French contracts, French intelligence assesses threat to French interests, French military or intelligence services support opposition groups or military factions. Coup or assassination removes leader. New government restores French contracts. French companies resume extraction at friendship prices. The violence enforced exploitation when African leaders sought fairness, making resistance appear suicidal and submission appear rational. France built their economy on our stolen resources while claiming we were poor because we were incompetent. French nuclear power program generating 70% of French electricity was built on Nigerian uranium, purchased at 15% of market value, saving France $14.7 billion over 65 years. French gold reserves backing the franc were accumulated partly through Burkinabe and Malian gold purchased at 15% of value, transferring $29.3 billion in wealth. French industrial development was financed partly through profits from minerals stolen from 13 African countries at 85% discount. Meanwhile, France claimed African poverty resulted from corruption, incompetence, or cultural factors rather than systematic theft. French economists published papers arguing that African underdevelopment reflected poor governance and weak institutions. French politicians gave speeches about need for African leaders to fight corruption and improve management. French media portrayed Africa as basket case requiring perpetual aid and guidance. The narrative blamed victims for poverty that theft created, obscuring exploitation through racist explanations attributing African poverty to African deficiency. We found the hidden clauses on page 47 of independence contracts through systematic research of colonial archives. I personally led research team that accessed French colonial archives in Aix-en-Provence where independence negotiations were documented. We requested contracts under Freedom of Information laws that France had passed in 2008. French archivists initially claimed contracts were classified for national security, but we sued under access laws and won after 18-month legal battle. In March 2023, we received 847 pages of documents, including the complete Burkina Faso independence contract. I read the contract methodically, analyzing every provision and cross-referencing with other agreements. Pages 1 to 46 contain standard diplomatic language. Page 47 contained the mineral resource clause. I immediately recognized its significance and calculated the theft it enabled. I verified that identical clauses existed in other countries' contracts by requesting them from national archives in Benin, Mali, Niger, and other former colonies. Every contract contained the same page 47 clause with the same formula. We exposed the theft publicly with evidence through publishing contracts, calculating stolen amounts, and documenting mechanisms. I held press conference in Ouagadougou on the 12th of April 2023, releasing the contract and presenting calculations showing $49.2 billion stolen from Burkina Faso. I published detailed analysis explaining how friendship prices worked and why they constituted theft. I provided copies to international media including Al Jazeera, BBC, and Le Monde, ensuring global coverage. The exposure created immediate political pressure. Burkinabe citizens were outraged learning that France had stolen wealth exceeding our entire GDP. Opposition parties that had previously defended French relations now demanded contract cancellation. Even government officials who had accepted French influence recognized that defending the contract was politically impossible. Public anger was so intense that maintaining the contract would have triggered government collapse. I organized 13 countries to cancel simultaneously through coordinating actions across former French colonies. I contacted leaders in Benin, Mali, Niger, and other countries sharing our research and proposing collective cancellation. I explained that simultaneous action would prevent France from isolating and punishing individual countries. I argued that collective cancellation would demonstrate continental unity and create momentum for broader liberation. Leaders initially hesitated, fearing French retaliation. I addressed fears by explaining that France couldn't coup 13 governments simultaneously, that international attention would constrain French violence, and that alternative partnerships with China and Russia would replace French relationships. I emphasized that continuing theft was politically unsustainable once citizens knew about it, making cancellation inevitable whether coordinated or isolated. Coordinated action was safer and more effective than isolated action. 12 countries agreed to coordinate, with Chad initially declining due to French military presence making government vulnerable to coup. On the 15th of July 2023, at 9 a.m. GMT, 13 African nations simultaneously announced contract cancellations through coordinated press conferences in their capitals. Statements were identical in structure, citing colonial coercion, ongoing theft, and national sovereignty as justifications. Coordination demonstrated unity and seriousness, making French divide-and-conquer tactics impossible. We renegotiated with fair partners at 95% of market price through engaging with China, Russia, and other nations offering genuine cooperation. Chinese state companies offered to purchase uranium at $56.35 per kilogram compared to French friendship price of $8.90 and market price of $59.30. Chinese offer of 95% of market value was fair and transparent, with prices adjusted quarterly based on published international market rates. Russia offered similar terms for gold and diamonds. India offered fair prices for phosphates and manganese. I negotiated Burkina Faso's agreement with China National Nuclear Corporation in August 2023. Contract specified 95% of market price, adjusted quarterly, with payments in yuan or gold at our choice. Contract included no political conditions, no requirements to purchase Chinese goods, no restrictions on our sovereignty. Contract was genuinely fair partnership between equals rather than exploitative relationship disguised as cooperation. The revenue increase was immediate and dramatic. Uranium sales that generated $133.5 million annually under French contract generated $845.5 million under Chinese contract, a 533% increase. Gold sales increased from $34.3 million to $217.3 million annually. Diamond sales increased from $45.4 million to $287.5 million annually. Total mining revenue increased from $213.2 million to $1.35 billion annually, a 533% increase, proving that fair prices generated 6 times more revenue than friendship prices. We built processing facilities to add value through investing $12.4 billion in refineries, smelters, and manufacturing plants. Uranium enrichment facility in Ouagadougou cost $234 million and increased uranium value by 400% through processing yellowcake into enriched uranium fuel. Gold refinery cost $89 million and added $121 million in annual value through producing finished bars and jewelry. Diamond cutting facility cost $67 million and added $89 million in annual value through processing rough diamonds into finished gems. Across all processing facilities in 13 countries, total investment was $12.4 billion, generating $67 billion in annual value addition. Return on investment, 540% annually. Processing facilities paid for themselves in 2.2 months and generated enormous profits thereafter. Processing proved that adding value through domestic manufacturing generated far more wealth than exporting raw materials, validating industrialization strategy that colonial powers had prevented for 65 years. We created 4.5 million jobs through processing instead of raw exports. Uranium enrichment employed 1,200 workers in Burkina Faso. Gold refining employed 340 workers. Diamond cutting employed 450 workers. Across 13 countries, processing facilities employed 47,000 workers directly. Including indirect employment in transportation, maintenance, and support services, total employment impact was 4.5 million jobs. Average wages of $12,000 annually generated $54 billion in wages, supporting 4.5 million families and stimulating broader economic activity. We increased revenues by $67 billion annually through capturing wealth that previously flowed to France. Higher prices from fair contracts generated $45 billion in additional revenue. Value addition through processing generated $22 billion in additional revenue. Total increase, $67 billion annually compared to French exploitation system. Over 20 years, cumulative additional revenue, $1.34 trillion that will build infrastructure, industries, and human capital transforming African development. We proved liberation was possible through demonstrating that threats could be resisted and alternatives existed. France threatened economic sanctions, but Chinese partnership provided trade relationships replacing French markets. France threatened aid cuts, but increased mining revenues exceeded French aid many times over. France threatened military intervention, but international attention and continental unity made violence politically costly. France threatened credit rating downgrades, but gold-backed currencies eliminated dependence on Western financial systems. Every threat was countered by alternatives that proved more beneficial than exploitative relationships we ended. Your secret is exposed through published contracts showing hidden clauses. The page 47 clause is now public knowledge, available in archives and online, impossible to hide again. Citizens across 54 African nations know about friendship prices and $340 billion in theft. Knowledge is irreversible. Once people understand exploitation, they cannot be made to forget. Your secret that operated for 65 years is permanently exposed, destroying foundation of exploitation that depended on ignorance. Your contracts are canceled through collective action you couldn't stop. 13 countries canceled simultaneously on the 15th of July 2023. France threatened retaliation but couldn't act against all countries at once. International attention prevented violence. Continental unity prevented isolation. By 2027, 47 of 54 African nations had canceled or renegotiated exploitative mining contracts, ending French theft across most of the continent. Your contracts that seemed permanent for 65 years were destroyed in 4 years through organized resistance. Your threats are empty through alternatives that replaced your relationships. Chinese partnerships provide better prices, fairer terms, and genuine cooperation. Russian relationships offer resource purchases without political conditions. Indian trade provides markets without exploitation. BRICS financing provides development capital without structural adjustment. South-South cooperation creates relationships between equals rather than between exploiter and exploited. Alternatives eliminate your leverage, making threats irrelevant because we don't need you anymore. Your theft is ended through fair prices that replaced exploitation. We receive $56.35 per kilogram for uranium instead of $8.90, capturing 95% of value instead of 15%. We receive $890 per ounce for gold instead of $133.50, capturing full value instead of fraction. We receive $890 per carat for diamonds instead of $133.50, ending transfer of wealth that built French economy while impoverishing ours. Fair prices generate $45 billion in additional annual revenue, proving that ending theft creates prosperity. Your power is broken through unity that overcame your divide and conquer. You maintained exploitation by isolating and punishing individual countries that resisted. You couldn't maintain exploitation when 13 countries resisted simultaneously and 47 countries joined liberation movement. Unity created strength that individual weakness couldn't achieve. Unity prevented isolation that made resistance suicidal. Unity demonstrated that collective action defeats individual power, breaking foundation of your control. We have fair prices instead of your robbery, receiving $56.35 per kilogram instead of $8.90 for uranium, $890 per ounce instead of $133.50 for gold, full market value instead of 15% friendship prices. We have processing facilities instead of raw exports, adding 400% value through refining uranium, processing gold into jewelry, cutting diamonds into gems, manufacturing finished products instead of shipping raw materials. We have African control instead of French theft, managing resources better than you did with 89% efficiency compared to your 67%, protecting environment that you poisoned, employing our people that you exploited. We have evidence instead of your lies, documenting $340 billion in stolen wealth through published contracts, calculated theft amounts, verified mechanisms. We have liberation instead of your exploitation. Proving prosperity comes from sovereignty through 533% revenue increase, 4.5 million jobs created, $67 billion in annual value addition. Evidence and results destroy propaganda, claiming exploitation was necessary or beneficial, proving that French relationship impoverished us while independence enriches us. The transformation is spreading as all 54 African nations discover and cancel exploitative colonial contracts in mining, fishing, timber, agriculture, and other sectors. Each exposure reveals systematic theft. Each cancellation increases revenues. Each renegotiation demonstrates alternatives. Each success encourages others. By 2025, 47 countries had addressed mining contracts. By 2026, 34 countries renegotiated fishing agreements. By 2027, 28 countries canceled timber contracts. The wave is building as liberation spreads across sectors and countries. Your era is finished as each exposure weakens your remaining influence. Every published contract destroys credibility. Every calculated theft amount generates anger. Every documented assassination proves violence. Every exposed mechanism reveals exploitation. You cannot rebuild influence destroyed by truth. You cannot restore relationships ended by knowledge of theft. You cannot maintain exploitation exposed by evidence. Your era of hidden theft and violent enforcement is permanently finished. Our time is beginning as each liberation strengthens our confidence and capability. Each canceled contract proves we can resist. Each renegotiated agreement proves we can secure fair terms. Each processing facility proves we can add value. Each created job proves we can develop. Each success builds confidence that previous generations lacked because they believed resistance was impossible. Our time of sovereignty and prosperity is beginning through demonstrated capability. The change is unstoppable as success breeds success and unity prevents isolation. Burkina Faso's success inspired 12 countries to act immediately. Their success inspired 34 more countries to investigate and cancel contracts. Each wave inspires the next. Each success proves possibility. Each liberation prevents reversal because citizens won't accept recolonization after experiencing sovereignty. Change has momentum that opposition cannot stop because mathematics prove liberation's benefits and evidence demonstrates exploitation's costs. The future belongs to Africa that controls its own resources through state ownership and fair partnerships, sets its own prices through market negotiations instead of coerced contracts, builds its own industries through processing instead of raw exports, and keeps its own wealth through capturing value instead of transferring it to former colonizers. This future is inevitable because it's economically superior, politically necessary, and morally right. Economics prove that capturing 95% of value generates more wealth than receiving 15%. Politics require sovereignty for legitimacy. Morality demands ending theft that impoverishes billions to enrich millions. I proved it works by exposing your hidden clause and increasing our revenue by 533% through renegotiation. The proof is mathematical. $845.5 million compared to $133.5 million annually. The proof is documented, published contracts, verified calculations, measured results. The proof is replicable. Same strategy works in every country, every sector, every exploitation mechanism. Proof destroys propaganda and enables action because people believe evidence over rhetoric. Others are proving it across 47 countries through replicating strategy of research, exposure, organization, resistance, and renegotiation. Each country adapts strategy to circumstances while following core principles. Find exploitation through research, expose it publicly with evidence, organize collective action preventing isolation, resist threats through unity and alternatives, renegotiate or cancel achieving fair terms, build processing adding value. Strategy works because it addresses root causes rather than symptoms, builds power rather than requesting favors, achieves sovereignty rather than accepting dependency. We are liberating the continent permanently through addressing exploitation in every sector until Africa controls its destiny. Mining liberation is largely complete with 47 countries achieving sovereignty. Fishing liberation is advancing with 34 countries renegotiating agreements. Timber liberation is beginning with 28 countries investigating contracts. Agricultural, telecommunications, and financial liberation will follow as we systematically address every exploitation mechanism. Complete liberation is inevitable because strategy is proven, momentum is building, and unity is strengthening. African unity guarantees everything through making isolation impossible, retaliation ineffective, and collective action unstoppable. The mathematics of 54 nations acting together defeats the power of individual former colonial nations attempting to maintain control. France cannot coup 54 governments. France cannot sanction 54 economies without devastating French interests. France cannot isolate 54 nations that coordinate actions. Unity creates power that individual weakness cannot achieve, transforming vulnerability into strength through collective action. The evidence of liberation's success defeats propaganda, claiming exploitation is necessary. France claimed friendship prices were necessary for African development, but 533% revenue increase after cancellation proves exploitation impoverished us. France claimed we couldn't manage resources, but 89% efficiency under African control compared to 67% under French management proves we manage better. France claimed we needed French partnership, but Chinese alternatives offering 95% of value compared to French 15% proves we need fair partners, not exploitative relationships. The momentum of spreading transformation defeats attempts to reverse progress. Each success makes reversal more difficult. Each liberation creates interests defending sovereignty. Each job created through processing generates workers opposing return to raw exports. Each dollar of increased revenue funds constituencies supporting independence. Momentum builds through creating facts on ground that opposition cannot easily reverse. Transformation becomes permanent through momentum that overwhelms resistance. Liberation is inevitable because it's economically beneficial, politically necessary, and morally right. Your theft is ending because evidence exposes it, unity resists it, alternatives replace it. Our sovereignty is rising because capability proves it, success validates it, momentum sustains it. The transformation is permanent because knowledge is irreversible, power is building, and justice is inevitable. The future is ours because we proved we can achieve it, we're building it systematically, and we won't accept anything less. Your era of theft and violence is finished. Our era of sovereignty and prosperity is beginning. The outcome is certain because mathematics, evidence, and justice guarantee everything.